it was quite a slog because it did make it through both sides of the legislature. The Assembly, it was a lot easier for them to push it through, but when we got to the Senate, it got into caucus, and it got down to 4 members of the Republican caucus expressing concern about the bill, 2 of whom were concerned with the statewide application of the proposed change in the evidentiary standard. So they were going to bump up the evidentiary standard for discipline from preponderance of the evidence to clear and convincing. And then there apparently were 2 others who were did not like initially that it was going to have a statewide impact overall. Now, part of that had been taken care of with a proposed amendment to require, for example, that when searching for members of your commission having firefighter or police experience, that smaller municipalities were only going to be required to make a good faith effort to find those, while we were going to be required to put those on. So that part kind of ameliorated it some, but there were it was only 4, and they needed to have at least 2 of those people be a yes in order for it to go on the floor for a vote.
Good work.
So that's,
we debated that here extensively
right.
with this committee.
And I talked to many legislatures, and they gave me some. I will say they were informative in terms of the concerns that their colleagues had about the bill, and their concerns did not line up with Milwaukee's concerns, for example, of going back to an era where we're paying officers who have allegedly committed crimes pending the outcome of the disciplinary appeal. That was not something that
didn't bother them.
No, that didn't seem to bother at all. The evidentiary standard was something that they were greatly concerned about.
Why did that bother them?
Because I think one issue is, and this is just true of the law, there's no set definition for what clear and convincing means, which means that when their boards go to have to use this, and they use it a lot less frequently than Milwaukee does, let's just be frank about it, right? Yeah. So when they actually do get to a place of having to discipline an officer or a firefighter and using that standard, and there's no set language for what that means, now you have a board of citizens trying to figure out how to implement it properly and then properly discipline, only to maybe have it overturned or challenged along the way. So that was a concern for them. I have been told that this bill, if the makeup of the legislature stays about the same, it will be reintroduced next session. So there could potentially be another fight about this come January.
The evidentiary standard also applied to all, so it affected other fire and police commissions throughout the state, whereas
that's my point.
Yeah, whereas the other really only impacted us.
Right. There were lots of the parts.
Well, it technically would have impacted them, but they don't have very many officers.
They don't have nearly the volume that we do, and most of the commissions, like Milwaukee's commission,
it would have impacted them in reality if they had an officer accused of a crime.
It would have.
It's
yes.
just they didn't think as a practical matter it would because it
was a state. Well, here was what I made the argument to them about that. We here in Milwaukee, our commission meets twice a month, every month of the year except for August. The volume of disciplinary appeals is, I think, at least 1 a month, around there. And we have the benefit of having a city attorney's office that has about 40 attorneys, and there's an attorney in that office who represents the chief, and there's a separate attorney in that office who can advise the commission on the law. Most smaller municipalities do not have that. So in terms of resources, they are already at a disadvantage. And we're talking about places where, you might have one municipal attorney, this is not their area of expertise or whatever, trying to figure out where the landmines are and something like that when you're in the midst of a disciplinary appeal is very, very difficult. And so that's how I made the argument to them that this is going to be a big burden on your smaller municipalities who do have fire and police commissions, because they don't even know what they're walking into because they haven't had to deal with it as often as we have. It's one of those things, you don't know what you don't know. That was how I made the argument about the evidentiary standard and what that was going to look like.
Have any of them spoken publicly or to you as lobbyists privately about why paying officers accused of crimes their salary doesn't concern them?
I don't think it has a palatable impact for them.
But I mean, you would think as defenders of the taxpayer, they would be concerned on Milwaukee taxpayers' behalf.
The counter argument that I heard was, when you discipline an officer, and if that officer is ultimately fired, that's the end of their career. And so we should take very seriously the notion that we're getting ready to cut off someone's pay. They're going to potentially lose their career and have to start all over. And so before you do that, we want to give them every opportunity along the way before their paycheck is stopped and their career is ended.
Every appeal opportunity is different than
right.
paying someone who's under serious criminal charge.
And I did make the argument that in instances
In fact,
where
they have incredible appeal rights.
they do, and I said, well, and when and if a
I mean, I shouldn't say incredible. They have
discharge-
adequate. They have extensive.
They do.
I mean, I think it's actually. It's
No,
some-
and I made the
it
argument, no
should.
other state employee, no other municipal employee gets the same benefit in terms of maintaining their pay, paying the outcome of an appeal. I said, and if an officer or firefighter who is ruled discharged at commission is ultimately reinstated, their pay is reinstated and their pensions are paid up. So it's not,
But we don't get the money back if it turns out they were
I
convicted.
made that point,
And they
too.
don't, and they're not walking the beat while they're under indictment.
I
are
made
they?
that point as well.
So we're paying. And I just don't understand. Do they actually?
They felt it was a compromised position from the original bill that passed several sessions ago so from the bill that passed several sessions ago to the ability that they used to have, they felt like this was a good midline compromise on that position. And correct me if I'm wrong, but that piece of payment of the officers only applied to Milwaukee.
Correct.
So that's why it wasn't as strong, whereas the evidentiary standard stuff applied to all fire and police, and so that's why.
I mean, I don't want. I mean, obviously, I'm arguing with the choir here, but
Yeah.
if in their town, whatever town it is, you got an officer accused of a crime. Turns out the officer's innocent, right? You want to obviously everyone's innocent until proven guilty. Well, in that case, they do get their back pay, right?
correct.
If it turns out they're found guilty, they want them to have been paid while not working. I mean, I just don't understand how anyone would justify to a taxpayer, to a resident, we paid an officer who turned out was guilty. We knew they might have been guilty, and because of that, they weren't working, and we paid them anyway up until the jury said so.
I agree with you that that's a very hard sell, but to point out that part only applied to the state of Milwaukee. So the only constituents who would be that would be asking those questions would be those of
And
Milwaukee.
I mean, to what extent? I mean, I get it. It failed for other reasons, and you were probably smart to just let it fail for other reasons then. But to what extent did you actually push them on? Do you realize how?
I did.
I don't know what adjective to use, but do you realize how this is just an indefensible position?
I did. I made the point that it was of further harm to our community
Yeah.
police relations. I made those points. I said, you're going to set us back. I was like, we're doing a lot of work to try to improve that, and something like this is only going to take us way back. And they acknowledged that's. They acknowledged the legitimacy of that argument, but it wasn't a seller for them in terms of a reason
Yeah.
to go on record as saying no, which is where we were. So a lot of people may just sit back and watch because they really, quite frankly, probably didn't really care one way or the other. But to try to get someone to actively say no, I think this is a bad idea on behalf of, that's a bigger push. So they understood the argument.
But putting it in the sense of, well, because if you put it in the sense of police-community relations, I can imagine what that means in their mind, which I don't even want to get into. But I just mean from their own rhetoric, from their own, we don't want to pay employees more than they're worth rhetoric, which is what Act 10 was all about.
But agreeing to the bill, there was not. I'm just gonna. This is very cynical, but there's no political harm to them for voting for it. I mean, just quite frankly. So, yeah, I ran up and down those stairs and met with as many of them as I could and tried to get them to understand where we were coming from. And it wasn't to say that many of them didn't understand. They absolutely did. They just wasn't a whole lot of. There was no.
They were afraid to not look law and order friendly.
But
I would argue it's not law and order friendly to pay for police who can't work because they're under indictment. How is that friendly to a law and order? It means you have less cops that you're paying that are actually walking the beat.
I was just going to add, too, to build out some context, the first white paper that we circulated right after the draft was introduced to try to really head off any sort of development, this was this past summer, we really did emphasize the argument that you're making, that it's like very disturbing and distasteful that we would pay officers who are being disciplined under certain circumstances. We had your same mindset, too, thinking that would be a very strong strategy, and for whatever reason, it just fell flat from the start. It just wasn't something that provoked that kind of visceral reaction that we anticipated. There were, to be fair, several legislators that we talked to did have very serious concerns, especially when we highlighted more egregious examples like the firefighter who was ultimately convicted on federal child pornography charges. We use that example. Of course, they're going to, react in a very strong way to that. It was very disturbing to them. But I think what Director Butler was saying is that it simply didn't provoke enough of a strong reaction that alone killed the bill from the start, because we did try to deploy that strategy early on.
Well, I was being maybe too polite before. Were they actually concerned about appearing to be anti-law and order, or were they concerned in the same way that Second Amendment people are actually they're more afraid of the NRA? Were they just afraid of the police union? Does the police union even have much sway with out-of-state legislators?
Without a city legislators?
Out of city, yeah. Outstate, as in not.
Outstate.
Outstate. Yes, I would say yes, absolutely.
Very much so. Very much so. A lot of what we noted in the bill were items that had been litigated in this city and that were rulings on behalf of the city or in the city's favor. So a lot of that appeared in this bill in an opposite form now. And like I said, I've been told that if I'm assuming as long as the legislature's makeup stays about the same in terms of Republican versus Democrat, this will be reintroduced.
Let me get this straight. The unions went to the legislature to get the legislature to reverse favorable decisions in the courts, favorable to the city of Milwaukee.
I don't know if the union went to or if they just heard about that this was going to be done and so said, hey, here are some things. I can't say to that, but I can say, having read that bill more times than I care to count at the moment, and looking at the things that were in there, I can tell you that there were lots of things in there that have been litigated in this city, and the city was successful on, that were now going to be reversed, essentially, with a change in the law.
Because the judges followed the law, we need to change the law.
Essentially, yes.
And because we'll use our partisan advantage to accomplish that, even though somebody in Ashland could care less.
Correct.
Good work.
Thank you. So it was, it's hard, and I know it sounds draconian, but I will say, I think the legislators that I talk to, even those who are not Democrats, they can be very forthcoming with information, even if it's in the midst of saying, I can't help you, right. Not directly. And so for those efforts, I do appreciate, because it does help us when we start having to recraft, or like we go out one way with one argument that we think is going to work and then it doesn't really. That's what helps shape how we then reapproach and reattack, because this was several prongs of attack along the way as it went from being drafted to introduced to being heard on committee on one side and then heard in committee on the other, and then ultimately being up there when it's on the floor and trying to see if you can't still influence folks.